Now that was a lot of talking about getStaticProps and getServerSideProps. But these are two key concepts, two key functions built into Next.js which you need all the time. As you see in my full course, for example, when we work on that full blog project, we use those functions everywhere. They are super important. And hence, let's also use them for the meetup detail page now. For the new meetup page, as explained earlier, we don't need them because here we don't need any data. And therefore there is no need to add getStaticProps. It's really only there to fetch data for the pre-generated page, if that page needs any data. And therefore we don't need it here. But on the meetup detail page, of course, we do have data that is needed. For the moment, hard-coded data, but that will change. And hence here on meetup details, we also want to use getStaticProps or getServerSideProps. Now, which one is better? It depends on how often your data changes and if you need access to the request object. And here it's probably fair to assume that the meetup data does not change very often. Indeed, this app doesn't even have a feature for changing the meetup data. We can only add meetups. But even if it would have a change feature, it would probably not be the case that a meetup changes multiple times every second. And therefore, for the meetup details, I would argue that, again, getStaticProps is better than getServerSideProps. So here we export getStaticProps, and we can turn it into an async function if we want to use async await. And then here we could fetch the data for a single meetup. And then we can, of course, return this object with the props. And here we could have our meetup data prop, or however you want to name it, which could again be a nested object, where we then have this data here. So where we have that image, so we have image set to the string, where we have the ID if we need it, M1, where we have the title, first meetup here, where we have the address, and that's this address, and where we then also have the description here, this description. That could be the props data which we send to this component function. But here we'll actually have a slight problem. Keep in mind that this is a dynamic page. So when we reach out to an API to fetch the data for a single meetup, we need a way of identifying that meetup. We need its ID, for example. Now, the ID, thankfully, is encoded in the URL. And therefore, we did learn that we can use that useRouter hook to get access to this router object and then use the query property there. That's what we did earlier in this course. But the problem with that is that the useRouter hook can only be used in the component function, not in getStaticProps. That's not a function where you can use React hooks. So we can't get the meetup ID from the URL with help of useRouter in here. But we also don't need to, because you might remember this context parameter which I mentioned. I showed it to you on getServerSideProps, but I mentioned that it also actually exists on getStaticProps. Now, when we accept it on getStaticProps, context will not hold request and response, but it will, for example, have a params key. So there will be context.params. And that will be an object where our identifiers between the square brackets will be properties, and the values will be the actual values encoded in the URL. So our meetup ID, for example, could be accessed with context.params.meetupID. Meetup ID because that's the identifier I have between the square brackets. And that would then be the concrete meetup ID for which we're displaying this meetup. I can console log this here inside of getStaticProps so that we can see that this really works. And then it's this meetup ID which we could set as an ID here if we want to expose it to the component function. With that, if we save this and visit the detail page of a single meetup, we get an error though. getStaticProps is required. Now, what's this error about?